My name is Marcus Foster. I'm a park ranger stationed at Olympic National Park in Washington State. It's a place known for its towering trees, endless greenery, and the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left on Earth. I came here looking for peace, hoping to leave behind the ghosts of my past, memories of war that still haunt me when I close my eyes. But what I found here was something far worse. It started last summer, during an unseasonably foggy week, the kind of fog that clings to your skin and makes you feel like you're being watched. 3 logging crews had vanished in the Hoh Rainforest area, a dense, ancient woodland that feels more alive than it should. My job was simple: investigate the disappearances and report back to Chief Reynolds, my boss. At least, that's what they told me. But nothing about this assignment was simple. I wasn't alone on this mission. Tommy Nakamura, a rookie ranger fresh out of training, was assigned to patrol with me. He was young, eager, and full of questions, always, asking about the forest's history or why certain trails were closed off. I didn't have answers for most of his questions. Truth be told, I didn't want answers. The less I knew about this place, the better. The first day of our patrol felt normal enough. We hiked through thick, moss-covered trails, marking down areas where erosion had made paths unsafe for visitors. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, things started to feel off. The air grew colder, even though it was mid-July. The usual. Sounds of birds and insects were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made every step echo louder than it should. Tommy was the first to notice something strange. "Hey, Marcus," he said, pointing at a tree ahead of us. "Does that look weird to you?" I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The bark on the tree wasn't smooth like it should have been. It had deep grooves carved into it, almost like someone had scratched it with giant claws. But what really caught my attention was what was embedded in the bark. A piece of fabric. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, probably just some hiker who got snagged, I said, trying to sound calm, even though my stomach was twisting into knots. Tommy didn't look convinced. "It's inside the tree," he said quietly. He was right. The fabric wasn't hanging off a branch or stuck on thorns. It was fused into the bark itself, as if the tree had grown around it. We decided to keep moving, but the unease stayed with us. As we continued our patrol, we found more signs that something wasn't right. Abandoned campsites with half-eaten meals left behind, footprints that led into the woods but never came back out, and trees that seemed to bleed sap when touched. Sap that smelled faintly metallic like blood. By the time we returned to the ranger station that evening, Tommy looked shaken. "Do you think those loggers are still alive?" he asked me as we unloaded our gear. I didn't answer him because I honestly didn't know what to say. That night, I couldn't sleep. The forest felt too quiet outside my cabin window, like it was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. When I finally drifted off around midnight, my dreams were filled with images of clawed trees and shadowy figures moving between them. The next morning brought more bad news. Another group of hikers had gone missing overnight. Chief Reynolds called me into his office and told me to focus on keeping visitors out of restricted areas instead of investigating further. "People get lost in these woods all the time," he said gruffly as he puffed on his pipe. "It's nothing new." But I could tell he didn't believe his own words. As I left his office, Tommy caught up with me outside and handed me a wildlife camera he'd set up near one of the trails we patrolled yesterday. "You need to see this," he said urgently. I took the camera from him and scrolled through the footage. At first, it showed nothing unusual, just trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, something appeared in one of the frames. A tall figure, standing between 2 trees in the distance. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, almost blending with the branches around it. And then it moved. Not like a person walking, it moved too fast for that, but not like an animal either. It seemed to glide from one tree to another in an instant, before disappearing completely. "What is that?" Tommy asked nervously. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something natural, and it wasn't something we could ignore. The next day, Tommy and I headed back into the forest. Neither of us talked much as we hiked deeper into the woods. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. It was one of those silences that made you feel like even the trees were listening. We decided to check out the area where Tommy had set up his wildlife camera. As we walked, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. I kept telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a person who got lost and didn't want to be found. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Tommy broke the silence. "Do you think we should tell Chief Reynolds about the footage?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not yet. He'd just tell us to focus on keeping hikers out of restricted areas." Tommy nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced. Honestly, neither was I. When we reached the spot where the camera had been set up, something immediately felt wrong. The ground was damp, even though it hadn't rained in days, and there was a strange smell in the air, like rotting wood mixed with something metallic. The tree where Tommy had mounted the camera looked different too. Its bark was darker, almost black, and when I touched it, my fingers came away sticky with sap that smelled faintly like blood. "This wasn't like this yesterday," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. That's when I noticed something else. There were no animal tracks anywhere nearby, no deer prints, no bird droppings, nothing. It was as if every living thing had decided to avoid this place. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to sound calm, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. As we continued deeper into the woods, things only got stranger. The trees seemed closer together than they should have been, their branches twisting in ways that didn't look natural. At one point, Tommy stopped and pointed at something on the ground. A footprint, but it wasn't a normal footprint. It was huge, at least twice the size of my boot, and instead of toes, it had long claw-like marks at the front. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Tommy asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, we don't want to run into it." We pressed on, our footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trees or a branch swaying when there was no wind. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then we found something that made my blood run cold. It was an old campsite, a tent half collapsed and covered in moss, a rusted camping stove lying on its side. But what caught my attention was what was inside the tent. A backpack with its contents spilled out onto the ground, and a sleeping bag that looked like someone had clawed their way out of it. Tommy crouched down and picked up a water bottle from the ground. "This doesn't look that old," he said. "Whoever was here couldn't have been gone for long." I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. "Let's head back," I said finally. "We'll report this to Chief Reynolds." Tommy nodded and stood up, but before we could leave, we heard something, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from all around us. It wasn't thunder or wind. It sounded almost like breathing. We froze in place, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. That's when we saw it, a figure standing about 50 feet away from us, partially hidden behind a tree. At first glance, it looked human, tall and thin with long arms, but as it stepped closer, I realized there was something horribly wrong about it. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light filtering through the trees. "Run," I whispered to Tommy. But before we could move, the figure let out an ear-piercing screech that echoed through the forest like nails on a chalkboard. My instincts kicked in. and I grabbed Tommy's arm, pulling him away from the campsite as fast as I could. We ran blindly through the woods, branches scratching at our faces and arms as we tried to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest by the time we finally stumbled onto one of the main trails leading back to the ranger station. When we burst through the door of the station, Chief Reynolds looked up from his desk with a frown. "What happened to you two?" he asked. But before either of us could answer, Tommy's radio crackled to life with a voice that sent chills down my spine. "Help! Me!" It was faint and distorted, but there was no mistaking who it belonged to. It was one of the loggers, who had gone missing weeks ago. The radio crackled again, louder this time. "Help me! It's dark. So dark!" The voice was weak, like whoever was speaking barely had the strength to get the words out. Tommy and I froze, staring at the radio on his belt. It was impossible. That voice, it sounded like Mike Harris, one of the loggers who'd gone missing weeks ago. But how could that be? Search teams had combed through every inch of this forest and found nothing. Chief Reynolds stood up from his desk, his face pale. "Where's that signal coming from?" he asked sharply. Tommy fumbled with the radio, his hands shaking. I don't know. It's not showing a location." "Try responding," I said quickly. Tommy pressed the button on his radio and spoke into it. "Mike, is that you? Where are you?" There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought we wouldn't get an answer. Then the voice came back, weaker than before. "The trees, they're alive. Don't let them take you too." And then silence. Tommy tried calling out again, but there was no response. The room felt heavy with tension, like we were all holding our breath at the same time. Reynolds broke the silence. "Pack your gear," he said firmly. "We're going. Out there." I hesitated. "Chief, are you sure that's a good idea? We don't even know where that signal came from." Reynolds shot me a look that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for arguments. "That man could still be alive," he said. "And if he is, it's our job to find him." I didn't like it, not one bit, but I nodded anyway. Tommy and I grabbed our packs and followed Reynolds out to the truck. The drive to the trailhead was quiet, except for the occasional crackle of static from Tommy's radio. Every time it happened, my stomach twisted into knots. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the trees. Reynolds handed each of us a flashlight and motioned for us to follow him into the woods. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Even with our flashlights, it felt like the shadows were pressing in on us from all sides. The trees seemed taller here, their branches tangled together like they were trying to block out the sky. "Keep an eye out for anything unusual," Reynolds said quietly. I almost laughed at that. Everything about this place felt unusual, but I kept my mouth shut and focused on scanning the area around us. After about an hour of hiking, we came across something that made my blood run cold. A pile of clothes lying in the middle of the trail. They were torn and covered in what looked like dried sap, but there was no sign of who they belonged to. Reynolds knelt down to examine them while Tommy and I stood guard. "These look like work clothes," he said after a moment. "Could be one of the loggers." Before I could respond, Tommy let out a startled gasp. "Did you see that?" he whispered urgently. "See what?" I asked, turning to look where he was pointing. "There, between those trees." He shone his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there now. "I didn't see anything," I said cautiously. "What did it look like?" Tommy hesitated, his face pale in the dim light. "I don't know. It was tall, really tall, and it moved fast." Reynolds stood up and dusted off his hands. "Let's keep moving," he said gruffly. We continued down the trail, but now every sound made my heart race. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig felt like something watching us from just out of sight. Then we heard it, a low groaning sound that seemed to come from all around us at once. It wasn't an animal or wind. It sounded almost human. "Stay close," Reynolds said tightly, gripping his flashlight like it was a weapon. We followed the sound until we reached a clearing, and what we saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, unlike any I'd ever seen before. Its trunk was twisted and gnarled, with thick roots that jutted out of the ground like claws. But what caught my attention were the shapes embedded in its bark, shapes that looked disturbingly human. Faces, dozens of them. Some were clear enough to make out their features. Eyes wide with terror, mouths frozen mid-scream, while others were distorted and half-formed, as if they'd been swallowed by the tree itself. Tommy stumbled back in horror, nearly dropping his flashlight. "What? What is this?" he stammered. Reynolds didn't answer. He just stared at the tree with a look of disbelief on his face. I took a step closer, despite every instinct telling me to run as far away as possible. That's when I noticed something else. One of the faces looked familiar. It was Mike Harris. His eyes seemed to follow me as I moved closer, and for a moment I thought I saw his lips move, but that was impossible, wasn't it? "We need to leave," Reynolds said suddenly, his voice shaking slightly. "Now." None of us argued with him. We turned and started back toward the trailhead as fast as we could, without breaking into a full-on sprint. But as we walked away from that clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. And when I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw something tall and thin moving between the trees behind us. We didn't stop running until we were back at the truck. None of us spoke as we climbed in, slamming the doors shut like that thin layer of metal and glass would somehow protect us from what we'd just seen. Reynolds started the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The drive back to the ranger station was silent, except for the hum of the engine. Tommy sat in the back seat, staring out the window like he was expecting something to jump out of the trees at any moment. I couldn't blame him. I felt the same way. When we finally pulled into the station parking lot, Reynolds turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. "What do we do now?" Tommy asked quietly. Reynolds sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "We don't say anything to anyone," he said firmly. "Not yet." Tommy looked shocked. "What?" "But we have to tell someone. People are disappearing out there. And what do you think they'll do about it?" Reynolds snapped. "Send more people into that forest to disappear too? No, we need to figure out what's going on first." I didn't like it, but I understood where he was coming from. Whatever was happening in that forest wasn't something you could explain in a report or a press conference. People wouldn't believe it, not until it was too late. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces in the tree, especially Mike Harris. I kept hearing his voice over the radio, begging for help. The guilt gnawed at me like a wild animal. He'd been out there all this time, trapped in some nightmare we couldn't even begin to understand, and we'd left him behind. Around midnight, I gave up on trying to sleep and decided to go through some old Ranger records instead. Maybe there was something in them that could explain what was happening, something we'd missed. The records room was small and dusty, filled with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. I started with the most recent files and worked my way backward, scanning through reports of missing hikers, strange animal behavior, and unexplained phenomena in the park. At first, nothing stood out, just the usual incidents you'd expect in a place like this. But then I found something that made my stomach drop. A report from 1978 about a group of loggers who'd gone missing in almost the exact same area where Mike Harris and his crew had disappeared. The details were eerily similar. Abandoned campsites, strange footprints, and sightings of a tall figure moving through the trees. The search teams had found no trace of the loggers except for one thing: a single tree with human faces embedded in its bark. I stared at the report, my hands trembling slightly. This wasn't new. It had happened before. And if it had happened once, How many other times had it been covered up? The next morning, I showed the report to Reynolds and Tommy. Reynolds didn't say anything at first. He just read through it with a grim expression on his face. "This doesn't leave this room," he said finally, setting the report down on his desk. "Why not?" Tommy asked angrily. "People need to know about this." "And what good would that do?" Reynolds shot back. "You think people are going to believe us? They'll call us crazy. Or worse, they'll come out here looking for whatever's in that forest and end up just like those loggers." Tommy opened his mouth to argue but closed it again when he saw the look on Reynolds' face. "Fine," he muttered, "but we can't just sit here doing nothing." "We're not," Reynolds said firmly. "We're going back out there tonight." I blinked in surprise. "Tonight? Why?" "Because whatever's out there doesn't want us poking around during the day," Reynolds said grimly. "If we're going to find answers and maybe save Mike Harris, we need to go when it's active." I didn't like it, not one bit, but I nodded anyway. Tommy looked less sure, but he eventually agreed too. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept over the forest, we geared up and headed back into the woods. This time we brought more than just flashlights. We each carried a flare gun and a hunting knife as well. The forest felt different at night, more alive somehow. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race faster than it should have. The shadows seemed deeper too, like they were hiding something just out of sight. We followed the trail back toward the clearing, where we'd seen that twisted tree with its horrible faces. None of us spoke as we walked. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor and our breathing echoing faintly in the still air. When we reached the clearing, I half expected to find it empty, but it wasn't. The tree was still there, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, but now there were more faces embedded in its bark than before, and one of them looked disturbingly familiar. "Reynolds," I said quietly. Pointing at one of the faces near the base of the trunk, he followed my gaze and froze. It was James Whitehawk, a local guide who'd gone missing 2 weeks ago while leading a group of hikers through this part of the park. Before any of us could say anything else, there was a sound behind us, a low growl that made every hair on my body stand on end. We turned slowly and saw them. Figures emerging from between the trees, tall and thin with pale skin stretched tight over their bones and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. They didn't move like people. They glided silently toward us without making a sound, except for that low growling noise that seemed to come from deep within their chests. "Run," Reynolds whispered hoarsely. But none of us moved. We stood frozen in place as the figures moved closer. Their glowing eyes cut through the darkness like tiny flashlights, and their movements were smooth, too smooth to be human. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Reynolds gripped his flare gun tightly, his knuckles white. "Stay together," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't let them separate us." Tommy was shaking so badly I thought he might drop his flashlight. What are they?" he stammered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, fast. One of the figures stopped just a few feet away from us, its pale skin glistening in the faint light from our flashlights. It tilted its head slightly, as if it were studying us. Then it opened its mouth, and what came out wasn't a scream or a growl, but a voice. "Marcus," it said softly. I froze. My name. It had said my name. "Marcus," the figure repeated, its voice hollow and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "You shouldn't have come back." My legs felt like they were made of concrete, but somehow I managed to speak. What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head again, and for a moment I thought I saw something familiar in its face, a resemblance to someone I'd known long ago. "You belong here," it said simply. Before I could process what that meant, Reynolds fired his flare gun into the air. The bright light illuminated the clearing for a brief moment, and the figures recoiled, their glowing eyes dimming slightly as they backed away into the shadows. "Move!" Reynolds shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the trail. We ran as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the forest. Tommy was right behind us, panting heavily, but managing to keep up. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw those figures moving between the trees, always just out of reach, but never far enough away to feel safe. When we finally burst out of the woods and into the parking lot near the ranger station, none of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, gasping for breath and staring at each other like we couldn't believe we'd made it out alive. "What was that?" Tommy asked finally, his voice trembling. Reynolds shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, it's not human." I leaned against the side of the truck, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing with questions I didn't want answers to but couldn't ignore. Why had that thing said my name? How did it know me? And what did it mean when it said I belonged there? Later that night, after Tommy had gone home and Reynolds had locked himself in his office with a bottle of whiskey, I sat alone in my cabin, staring at an old photo album I hadn't looked at in years. The album was filled with pictures of my family, my parents, my younger sister Sarah and me when we were kids. We'd lived near Olympic National Park back then, just on the edge of town, and spent most of our weekends hiking through the trails or camping under the stars. But there was one photo that stood out, a picture of me standing next to my father in front of an old tree deep in the woods. The tree looked familiar, too familiar, and when I looked closer at its bark, I realized why. There were faces embedded in it. I slammed the album shut and pushed it away like it had burned me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely breathe. My father had always been fascinated by the forest. He'd told me stories about how it was alive in ways most people couldn't understand. He'd said there were secrets hidden among its trees that only a few people ever got to see, and even fewer survived to tell about them. I'd thought he was just making up stories to scare me back then, but now I wasn't so sure. Next morning, I went to see James Whitehawk's grandmother, a woman named Agnes who lived on the reservation near town. She'd always been kind to me when I was growing up, treating me like one of her own grandchildren whenever Sarah and I visited her shop for candy or soda. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her face softened into a smile. But when she saw the look on my face, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. "I need to know about the forest," I said bluntly. "About what's really out there." Agnes sighed and motioned for me to come inside. She led me to her living room and gestured for me to sit down while she poured us both cups of tea. "You've seen them," she said quietly as she handed me my cup. I nodded slowly. "What are they?" Agnes sat down across from me and stared into her tea for a long moment before answering. "They're spirits," she said finally. "Not good ones, not bad ones either. Just lost." "Lost?" I repeated. She nodded. Again. They were people once, people who got too close to something they shouldn't have. Her eyes met mine then, and her expression turned serious. "The forest doesn't like outsiders poking around where they don't belong." I swallowed hard. Why did one of them say my name? Agnes hesitated before answering. "Because you're not an outsider," she said simply. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" She sighed again and set her tea down on the table between us. "Your family has always been connected to this place," she explained softly. "Your father knew that, and now you do too." Agnes's words echoed in my head as I left her house and drove back to the ranger station. "Your family has always been connected to this place." What did that even mean? My father had loved the forest, sure, but I didn't see how that made me part of whatever was happening out there. The drive felt longer than usual, the trees on either side of the road seeming to close in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. By the time I reached the station, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Reynolds was waiting for me inside, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said as soon as I walked through the door. "What now?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He handed me a stack of papers, incident reports from nearby towns. At first glance, they didn't seem connected. A dog attacking its owner in Forks, a car crashing into a tree near Port Angeles, a hiker found wandering in circles near the park's edge, unable to remember how he got there. But then I looked closer and realized there was a pattern. All of these incidents had happened within a few miles of the forest, and all within the last 48 hours. "It's spreading," Reynolds said quietly. I looked up at him, my stomach sinking. "What is?" "Whatever's out there," he said. "It's not just staying in the woods anymore." Tommy walked in then, holding his radio like it might bite him. "We just got another call," he said nervously. "A couple driving through the park saw something on the side of the road, said it looked like a person, but not." Reynolds swore under his breath and grabbed his jacket. "Let's go." The three of us piled into the truck and headed toward the spot where the couple had reported seeing whatever it was. The sun was starting to set again, casting long shadows across the road. None of us spoke as we drove. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. When we reached the spot, there was no sign of anyone or anything. But there were tracks leading away from the road and into the forest. They were huge, like the ones Tommy and I had seen before, with long claw-like marks at the front. "Stay close," Reynolds said, as we followed the tracks into the woods. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind rustling through the trees. It felt like we'd stepped into another world entirely. After about 10 minutes of walking, we found something that made my blood run cold. An abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters from broken poles. A backpack lay on its side nearby, its contents spilled out onto the ground. But what really caught my attention was what was inside the tent. A pile of leaves and twigs arranged in a rough circle around a small wooden carving of something. It looked almost human but distorted, its limbs too long, its face twisted into an expression of pure terror. "What is that?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. But it doesn't look like something you'd buy at a souvenir shop." Reynolds knelt down to examine it more closely, but didn't touch it. "This isn't good," he muttered. Before I could ask him what he meant by that, there was a sound. Behind us, a low growl that made every hair on my body stand on end. We turned slowly and saw them again. The figures from before were standing just beyond the edge of our flashlight's beams, their glowing eyes watching us silently. There were more of them this time, at least half a dozen, and they were closer than they'd been before. "Back away," Reynolds whispered urgently. Slowly. We did as he said, moving carefully toward the trail without taking our eyes off those things. But then one of them stepped forward, and this time it didn't stop. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen before. One moment it was standing still, and the next it was right in front of us. Its face was inches from mine now, and for a split second I thought I recognized it. But then it opened its mouth and let out an ear-piercing screech that sent us all stumbling backward. Reynolds fired his flare gun again, and this time one of the figures caught fire, but instead of screaming or running away, it just stood there silently as flames consumed its body. The other figures didn't react. They just watched as their companion burned to ash before disappearing back into the shadows. "What are they?" Tommy asked again as we ran back toward the truck. "I don't know," Reynolds shouted over his shoulder. "But they're not stopping." When we finally reached safety and slammed ourselves inside the truck again, none of us spoke for several minutes. We were too busy trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. "They're getting bolder," Reynolds said finally, breaking the silence. I nodded numbly. He was right. Whatever these things were, they weren't content to stay hidden anymore. And if we didn't figure out how to stop them soon, I wasn't sure anyone would be safe. Not here or anywhere else. The next morning, the three of us sat around the ranger station's small conference table, trying to figure out what to do next. None of us had slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me, or the figure that had burned without so much as a scream. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us," Tommy said, his voice shaking slightly. "We have to do something." Reynolds nodded, rubbing his temples like he had a headache. "I agree. But what? We don't even know what we're dealing with." I thought about what Agnes had told me the day before, about the spirits being lost and the forest not liking. Outsiders, it wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. "There has to be a way to stop them," I said, "or at least slow them down." Reynolds looked at me skeptically. "And how do you propose we do that?" I hesitated before answering. "Agnes, James Whitehawk's grandmother, she said these things are spirits. Maybe there's some kind of ritual or something we can do to send them back." Tommy frowned. "Like an exorcism?" "Not exactly," I said quickly, "but something like that." Reynolds sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's a long shot," he said, "but at this point, I'll take anything." We spent the rest of the day gathering supplies: candles, matches, salt, and anything else Agnes thought we might need for the ritual she described over the phone. She didn't sound confident when she explained it, but I could tell she was trying her best to help. By the time night fell, we were ready, or as ready as we could be under the circumstances. The plan was simple. We'd go back to the clearing where we'd seen the tree with the faces and perform the ritual there. According to Agnes, that tree was likely the source of whatever was happening in the forest. If we could sever its connection to the spirits, they might lose their power, or at least stop spreading beyond the woods. It sounded crazy. But then, again, so did everything else that had happened over the past few days. We drove back into the forest in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The air felt heavier than usual as we hiked toward the clearing, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When we reached the tree, it looked even worse than before. More faces had appeared in its bark, some of them familiar, others not, and a thick black sap was oozing from its trunk like blood. "This is it," Reynolds said grimly as he set up the candles around the base of the tree in a rough circle. Tommy sprinkled salt along the ground while I lit each candle one by one. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows across the clearing, making it feel even more otherworldly than it already did. Once everything was in place, I pulled out the piece of paper where I'd written down Agnes's instructions and began reading. Aloud, the words felt strange in my mouth, like they didn't belong to me, but I forced myself to keep going. The air around us seemed to grow colder with every word I spoke, until my breath came out in visible puffs of steam. At first, nothing happened. Then, everything happened at once. The ground beneath our feet began to shake violently, and a deafening roar filled the air, a sound so loud it felt like my eardrums might burst. The candles flickered wildly before going out completely, plunging us into darkness. "Marcus!" Tommy shouted over the noise. "What's happening?" "I don't know!" I yelled back. Before I could say anything else, something slammed into me from behind, knocking me to the ground. When I looked up, one of those figures was standing over me, its glowing eyes burning into mine as it reached out with one long, bony hand. Reynolds fired his flare gun again, and this time it hit its target dead on. The figure let out an ear-piercing screech as it burst into flames and disappeared into ash, but more were coming now. They emerged from between the trees one by one until there were too many to count, all of them moving toward us with that same unnatural glide that made my skin crawl. "Fall back," Reynolds shouted as he grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. We ran as fast as we could through the forest, dodging branches and roots that seemed determined to trip us up. The figures followed close behind, their glowing eyes lighting up the darkness like tiny lanterns. By some miracle, we made it back to the truck without losing anyone, but just barely. As soon as we slammed ourselves inside and locked the doors, Reynolds floored it and sped away from there as fast as he could. None of us spoke on the drive back, not because we didn't have anything to say, but because we were too scared to say it. When we finally reached safety at the ranger station again, Reynolds turned off the engine and sat there for a long moment before speaking. "Well," he said finally, "that didn't work." I didn't respond because he was right. It hadn't worked at all. If anything, it had only made things worse. The ranger station felt too quiet when we got back. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the room as we sat around the table, trying to catch our breath. None of us spoke for a long time. What could we say? The ritual had failed, and now those things knew we were trying to stop them. Tommy broke the silence first. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I stared down at my hands, which were still shaking from the adrenaline. My mind was racing, but every thought led to a dead end. "How do you fight something? You don't even understand." Reynolds leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "We're missing something," he said finally. "There's got to be a reason why this is happening, and a way to stop it." I thought about what Agnes had told me earlier, that my family was connected to the forest somehow. It didn't make sense, but it felt like the only lead we had left. "There's someone who might know more," I said hesitantly. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Agnes Whitehawk," I said. "She told me my family has some kind of connection to this place. I think she knows more than she's letting on." Reynolds frowned but nodded after a moment. "All right," he said. "Let's pay her another visit." We piled into the truck again and drove to Agnes's house on the reservation. The sun was just starting to rise as we pulled into her driveway, casting long shadows across the ground. She was already waiting for us on her porch, as if she'd known we were coming. "I told you not to go back there," she said as we climbed out of the truck. "We didn't have a choice," Reynolds replied gruffly. Agnes sighed and motioned for us to follow her inside. She led us to her living room, where a fire crackled softly in the fireplace. The warmth was comforting after the cold of the forest, but it did little to ease the tension in the room. "You've seen them," Agnes said quietly as she sat down across from us. I nodded. "And they've seen us." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if saying a silent prayer. When she opened them again, her expression was serious. "They're not going to stop," she said simply. "Why not?" Tommy asked nervously. "Because they can't," Agnes replied. "They're bound to this place, trapped between worlds. They were once people, but now they're something else entirely." "How do we stop them?" Reynolds asked bluntly. Agnes hesitated before answering. "You can't destroy them," she said finally, "but you can contain them." "Contain them how?" I asked. She stood up and walked over to a shelf filled with old books and artifacts. After a moment of searching, she pulled out a small leather-bound journal and handed it to me. "This belonged to your father," she said softly. I stared at her in shock. "My father? How did you—" "He gave it to me before he disappeared," she said simply. I opened the journal with trembling hands and began flipping through its pages. It was filled with notes and sketches, maps of the forest, descriptions of strange phenomena, and detailed drawings of the tree with the faces embedded in its bark. One page caught my attention, a sketch of a circle made of stones surrounding what looked like an ancient tree. Beneath it were instructions written in my father's handwriting. "The heart must be contained before it spreads beyond the forest." What does this mean? I asked Agnes, holding up the journal. She took a deep breath before answering. The tree you saw, it's not just any tree, she said. It's the heart of this forest, the source of its power. And those things? Reynolds asked. They're its guardians, Agnes replied. They protect it at all costs. I stared at her in disbelief. So you're saying we have to trap this heart? She nodded solemnly. It won't be easy, she said. The Guardians will do everything they can to stop you. How do we do it? Tommy asked nervously. Agnes pointed at the sketch in my father's journal. You'll need ironwood saplings, 7 of them, to create a containment circle around the heart tree, she explained. Once they're planted and blessed, they'll bind its power and keep it from spreading. Where do we get ironwood saplings? Reynolds asked skeptically. There's a grove near the edge of the forest, Agnes replied. But be careful. The Guardians will sense what you're trying to do. I looked down at my father's journal again, my mind racing with questions I didn't have time to ask. If what Agnes was saying was true, then my father had known about all of this, and he'd tried to stop it before disappearing without a trace. Why didn't he tell me? I asked quietly. Agnes placed a hand on my shoulder and looked at me with sad eyes. He was trying to protect you, she said softly. Reynolds stood up abruptly, breaking the silence that had settled over the room like a heavy fog. All right, he said firmly, we've got work to do. The plan was simple on paper but terrifying in reality. We'd head to the ironwood grove Agnes had mentioned, collect 7 saplings and plant them in a circle around the heart tree. Once the circle was complete, we'd perform the blessing she had taught us to bind its power. But there was one catch. The Guardians would sense what we were doing and try to stop us. Agnes warned us that the ritual would work best during a lunar eclipse, which just so happened to be that very night. The eclipse will weaken the connection between their world and ours, she explained. It's your best chance. There wasn't much time to prepare. We gathered everything we thought we'd need: shovels, flashlights, flare guns, and the saplings themselves, which Agnes had already prepared for us. She handed me a small pouch of herbs and a piece of paper with the blessing written on it. Be careful, she said as we loaded up the truck. And whatever you do, don't stop until the circle is complete. We drove back into the forest as the sun began to set. The air felt heavier than ever, like the forest itself knew what we were planning. None of us spoke as we hiked toward the heart tree, our footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. When we reached the clearing, it was just as we'd left it, dark and silent, with that twisted tree standing in the center like some kind of ancient monument. The faces in its bark seemed to watch us as we approached, their expressions frozen in terror. Let's get this over with, Reynolds said grimly. We split up to plant the saplings at equal distances around the tree. Each of us carried 2 saplings and a shovel, moving quickly but carefully through the dense undergrowth. The shadows seemed to shift around us as we worked, and every so often I thought I heard whispers coming from somewhere just out of sight. By the time we planted the 5th sapling, the moon was high in the sky and starting to disappear behind the shadow of the earth. The eclipse had begun. That's 5 down, Reynolds said as he finished planting his 2nd sapling. 2 more to go. Tommy nodded nervously. Let's hurry. As I dug a hole for my 2nd sapling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see one of those figures standing there. But there was nothing. Until there was. I didn't hear it approach. I just looked up and saw it standing a few feet away from me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. It didn't move or make a sound. It just stared at me like it was waiting for something. Marcus! Tommy shouted from across the clearing. Behind you! I didn't think. I just grabbed my flare gun and fired. The flare hit the figure, square in the chest, and it let out an ear-piercing screech as it burst into flames and crumbled into ash. But more were coming now. They emerged from between the trees, one by one. Tall, thin figures with glowing eyes that burned like fire. There were too many to count, and they were closing in fast. "Keep planting," Reynolds shouted as he fired his own flare gun at one of them. We worked as quickly as we could, digging holes and planting saplings while trying to fend off the Guardians at the same time. It felt like an impossible task. Every time we took one down, two more seemed to take its place. By the time we planted the 7th sapling, I was covered in dirt and sweat, my hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. The eclipse was nearly complete now. The moon was almost entirely hidden behind Earth's shadow. "Now!" Agnes's voice echoed in my head as I pulled out the pouch of herbs and began scattering them around the circle. Reynolds and Tommy joined me in reciting the blessing Agnes had taught us. The words felt strange in my mouth, ancient and powerful, but I forced myself to keep going even as the Guardians closed in around us. The air grew colder with every word we spoke until frost began forming on the ground beneath our feet. The Guardians stopped moving then. They just stood there silently, their glowing eyes fixed on us as if they were waiting for something. When we finished reciting the blessing, there was a moment of silence so complete it felt like time itself had stopped. And then everything happened at once. The ground beneath our feet began to shake violently, and a deafening roar filled the air, a sound so loud it felt like my eardrums might burst. The heart tree began to glow faintly, its bark cracking open like a wound as black sap poured out onto the ground. The Guardians let out a collective screech that made my blood run cold before collapsing into piles of ash one by one. The light from the heart tree grew brighter until it was almost blinding, and then it disappeared entirely. When I opened my eyes again, everything was still. The heart tree stood silent and lifeless in its circle of ironwood saplings, its bark no longer twisted or bleeding, but smooth and pale like any other tree. "It's done," Reynolds said quietly. I nodded numbly, unable to find words for what I was feeling. Relief, exhaustion, grief, maybe all three at once. We made our way back to the truck in silence, leaving behind whatever remained of those lost souls trapped in that cursed forest. The drive back to the ranger station was quiet. None of us spoke. We were too drained, both physically and mentally, to say anything. The forest around us seemed different now. It was still dark, still vast, but it felt quieter, calmer, almost like it was finally at peace. When we reached the station, Reynolds turned off the truck and sat there for a moment, staring out at the trees. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked softly. I didn't know how to answer him. Part of me wanted to believe it was, that we'd done what we came to do and stopped whatever had been haunting this place. But another part of me couldn't. Forget the faces in that tree or the way those figures had looked at us, like they were more than just spirits, like they were something ancient and angry. "I hope so," I said finally. Tommy climbed out of the truck and leaned against the side, his face pale in the dim light. "I don't think I'll ever set foot in those woods again," he muttered. Reynolds gave him a small, tired smile. "Can't say I blame you." We spent the rest of the night cleaning up and writing our reports. Of course, we left out most of what had actually happened. No one would believe us if we told them the truth. Instead, we wrote about unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife, recommending that the area around the heart tree be closed off indefinitely. By the time morning came, I felt like a ghost myself, exhausted and hollowed out from everything we'd been through. But there was one more thing I needed to do before I could move on. I drove back to Agnes's house alone. She was waiting for me on her porch again, her sharp eyes studying me as I walked up to her. "It's done," I said simply. She nodded slowly. "I felt it," she said softly. "The forest is quiet now." I hesitated before asking the question that had been gnawing at me since last night. "Why didn't my father finish it?" I asked. "If he knew how to stop it, why didn't he?" Agnes sighed and motioned for me to sit down beside her. "Your father tried," she said quietly. but he didn't have enough time or enough help. I stared at her, my chest tightening. What happened to him? She looked away then, her gaze fixed on something far in the distance. The forest took him, she said simply. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, I'd held on to hope that maybe he'd just left, walked away from everything without looking back. But now I knew the truth. He'd sacrificed himself trying to protect this place and me. "I'm sorry," Agnes said softly. I nodded numbly, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. After a long moment of silence, she reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did what he couldn't," she said gently. "You gave this place a chance to heal." Her words brought a small measure of comfort, but they didn't erase the weight of what we'd done or what we'd lost along the way. When I returned to the ranger station later that day, Reynolds was waiting for me outside with a cup of coffee in hand. "You all right?" he asked as I climbed out of my truck. "Not really," I admitted. He nodded like he understood exactly how I felt, and maybe he did. "You did good out there," he said after a moment. "So did you," I replied. Tommy joined us a few minutes later, looking more rested than he had earlier, but still shaken by everything that had happened. We stood there together for a while, watching as the sun rose higher in the sky and cast its warm light over the forest. For once, it looked almost normal. But deep down, I knew things would never really be normal again. Not for any of us. Epilogue. A few weeks later, new rangers arrived at Olympic National Park to take over our posts. Reynolds retired early and moved to a small cabin near the coast where he could fish and spend his days in peace. Tommy transferred to another park, far from Washington State, one without dense forests or ancient secrets lurking among its trees. As for me, I stayed behind, not as a ranger, but as something else entirely. Agnes called it a guardian. She said someone needed to watch over this place now that its balance had been restored, to make sure no one disturbed what we'd worked so hard to contain. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. The heart tree still stands, in its circle of ironwood saplings, silent and lifeless, but still holding on to its secrets. Sometimes I visit it late at night, when the forest is quietest, and sit beneath its branches, wondering if my father is still out there somewhere, watching over me like I'm watching over this place. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear his voice in the wind, telling me that everything is going to be all right. But even now, there are moments when I catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trees, or a faint glow in the distance, and wonder if it's really over, or if this forest has more secrets left to reveal. My name is Joseph Collins, and I've spent most of my life underground. Some people fear tight spaces, but for me, caves have always been home. I'm a park ranger now, stationed at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. But before that, I was a coal miner like my father. He died in a mine collapse when I was just a boy. Funny thing is, even after losing him like that, I never stopped feeling drawn to the dark. It was early October 1972 when everything started. Heavy rains had flooded parts of the park, uncovering a new cave entrance deep within the forest. It wasn't on any of our maps, and that made it my responsibility to check it out. Normally, this would have been routine work, marking passages, checking for stability. But this time was different. 3 surveying teams had already gone missing in the area over the past month. Some folks said they got lost or trapped by cave-ins. Others whispered about something more sinister. I didn't believe in ghost stories or monsters back then. I thought there had to be a logical explanation for everything until I stepped into that cave. The air inside was cold and damp, with a faint metallic smell that clung to my nostrils. My boots crunched on loose gravel as I made my way deeper into the passage. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and shapes carved into the limestone that didn't look natural. At first, I thought they might be Native American petroglyphs, but something about them felt off. About an hour in, I found the first sign of trouble, an abandoned rope dangling from a ledge above me. It was still tied securely to an anchor point, but there was no sign of who had left it there. Nearby, I spotted a flashlight lying on the ground. It was still on, casting a weak beam of light against the wall. That's when I noticed something strange about the echoes in this cave. Normally, caves amplify sound. You can hear your own footsteps bouncing back at you, but here it was like the walls swallowed every noise I made. When I called out to see if anyone was nearby, my voice didn't echo at all. Instead, it felt like it just disappeared into the darkness. As I pressed on, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A human hand fossilized in the rock wall. It looked ancient at first glance, like something you'd see in a museum, but when I touched it, it felt warm. I pulled back immediately and shone my flashlight around the chamber. That's when I saw them. Paintings on the walls depicting tall, thin figures pulling people into what looked like solid stone. The figures had long arms and hollow faces with gaping mouths that seemed to scream silently. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these weren't ordinary cave paintings. They were warnings. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at those strange paintings on the walls. My flashlight flickered slightly, and I cursed under my breath. The last thing I needed was for the batteries to die while I was this deep in the cave. I tapped it a couple of times and the light steadied, but my nerves didn't. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the hand in the wall wasn't warm. It was probably just my own body heat making me think that. And those paintings? Just ancient artwork, nothing more. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, something about this place felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the carvings. It was like the air itself was pressing down on me, heavier than it should have been. I decided to keep moving. Turning back wasn't an option yet. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some creepy drawings scare me off. The tunnel ahead sloped downward, and as I walked, I noticed the ground beneath me was getting softer, almost like mud. The metallic smell in the air grew stronger too, sharp enough to make my stomach churn. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from deeper in the cave. At first I thought it might have been water dripping from the ceiling, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't water at all. It sounded like whispering. I froze, holding my breath to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The whispers were faint, barely audible, but they were definitely there. It wasn't just one voice either. It sounded like a dozen people murmuring all at once, their words overlapping so much that I couldn't make out what they were saying. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to stay calm. The whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound itself. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my chest. I shone my flashlight around the tunnel, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just empty darkness stretching out ahead of me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep going. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me or some kind of natural phenomenon I didn't understand. That's what I told myself anyway. After a few more minutes of walking, I came across something else, a backpack lying on the ground. It looked old and worn out, covered in dirt and dust like it had been there for years. When I picked it up, though it felt heavier than I expected, I unzipped it carefully and found a notebook inside. The pages were damp and smudged with mud, but some of the writing was still legible. Most of it didn't make much sense. Just scribbled notes about rock formations and measurements. But one page caught my attention immediately. It read, "Don't follow them." That's all it said. Just 3 words scrawled across the page in shaky handwriting. My hands started to shake as I stared at those words. Who had written this? And who or what was them? Before I could think too much about it, something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow darting across the wall, just outside the beam of my flashlight. "Who's there?" I shouted, spinning around to face whatever it was. There was no answer, just that oppressive silence again, but this time it felt different. It felt like something was watching me. I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness where I thought I saw the shadow move. My flashlight beam trembled as my hand shook. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was in here with me. The silence pressed down harder. Now, like the cave itself was holding its breath. I took a cautious step forward, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The metallic smell in the air was stronger than ever, almost overwhelming. I tried to focus on my breathing, keeping it steady, but every little sound, every crunch of gravel underfoot felt deafening. Then I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was closer. It wasn't just faint murmurs anymore. It sounded like voices coming from all around me. They were soft and distant at first, but as I stood there, they grew louder and clearer. It was still impossible to make out what they were saying, but there was something wrong about the way they sounded. The voices didn't overlap naturally. They seemed disjointed, like they were coming from broken mouths. "Hello?" I called. Out again, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a low scraping sound, like metal dragging against stone. It echoed through the tunnel, sending chills down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to turn back and leave this place behind. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. I forced myself to move forward, one step at a time. My flashlight beam flickered again as I rounded a bend in the tunnel. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just ahead of me. At first I thought it was a person. It was tall and thin, with long arms that hung unnaturally low at its sides. Its back was turned to me, and its head tilted slightly, as if it were listening for something. The light from my flashlight barely reached it, but what little I could see made my stomach churn. Its skin wasn't right. It looked pale and almost translucent, like wax stretched too thin over bone. And its head was all wrong. It didn't have any hair or ears, just a smooth surface where its face should have been. I stumbled backward instinctively, my heart pounding so hard that it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there completely still, but then its head began to turn toward me. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. All I could do was stand there as its head turned further and further until it had twisted all the way around to face me. It didn't have eyes or a nose, just a gaping black hole where its mouth should have been. The figure let out a low, guttural sound that echoed through the cave like a growl. Then it started moving toward me, not walking or running, but gliding across the ground as if its feet weren't even touching the floor. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. Turned and ran as fast as I could back up the tunnel. The ground beneath me felt slick and uneven, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The whispering started again behind me, louder this time and more frantic, like dozens of voices screaming over each other. I didn't dare look back. My flashlight flickered wildly as I sprinted through the darkness. The tunnel seemed longer now than it had on the way in, like it was stretching out ahead of me on purpose. My lungs burned with every breath, but I pushed myself harder, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of daylight up ahead. Relief washed over me as I stumbled out of the cave and into the open air. The sun had already started to set, Casting long shadows across the forest floor, I collapsed onto the ground outside the entrance, gasping for breath and clutching at my chest. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold onto my flashlight anymore. But even as I sat there in the fading light, trying to calm myself down, one thought kept running through my mind. I wasn't alone in that cave, and whatever was in there, it wasn't human. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing again. Its twisted head, its hollow face, the way it glided toward me like it didn't belong in this world. I stayed up in my small cabin at the edge of the park, sitting by the window and staring out into the dark forest. Every rustle of leaves or creak of wood made my heart jump. By morning, I knew I couldn't just leave it alone. Whatever was in, that cave wasn't natural. It wasn't something that should exist. But I also knew I couldn't go back in there unprepared. I needed to figure out what I was dealing with first. The first thing I did was report what I'd seen to my supervisor, Mark. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the type who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see with his own eyes. When I told him about the figure in the cave, he gave me a long, skeptical look. "Joe," he said finally, leaning back in his chair, "you've been working too hard. Maybe you're just stressed out. Caves can mess with your head, you know. The darkness, the silence. It's easy to imagine things." "I wasn't imagining it," I said firmly. "There's something down there, Mark, something not human." He sighed and rubbed his temples. "Look, we'll send another team to check it out later this week. For now, why don't you take a few days off? Get some rest." I could tell he didn't believe me, and honestly, I didn't blame him. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I wouldn't have believed them either. But I couldn't just sit around and wait for another team to go missing. So after leaving Mark's office, I headed straight to the library in town. It was a small place, just a single room lined with dusty shelves, but it had what I needed, old maps and records of the area. I spent hours combing through them, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Most of it was just geological surveys and historical accounts of early settlers, but then I came across something strange. An old journal written by a man named Samuel Grayson. Samuel had been a miner in the late 1800s, back when coal mining was booming in Kentucky. His journal described how his crew had stumbled upon an uncharted cave while digging a new shaft. At first, they thought they'd struck gold, literally. But as they explored deeper into the cave, they started noticing strange things. Whispers. Samuel wrote on one page, "Coming from nowhere and everywhere at once." On another page, "Shadows that move when there's no light." And finally, "They took Jacob last night, pulled him into the wall like it was water." My hands trembled as I read those words. It sounded exactly like what I'd seen. The whispers, the shadows, even the carvings on the walls. The last entry in Samuel's journal sent chills down my spine. "They are not of this world. They feed on fear and darkness. If you find this place, leave." I closed the journal and sat back in my chair, trying to process what I'd just read. Could it really be true? Could there be something ancient and evil lurking beneath the ground? Part of me wanted to believe it was all just a coincidence, that Samuel's story was nothing more than an old miner's tale meant to scare people away from dangerous caves. But deep down, I knew better. I packed up my things and left the library as quickly as I could. The sun was already starting to set by the time I got back to my cabin, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, a thought crossed my mind that made my blood run cold. What if whatever was in that cave wasn't trapped down there? What if it could follow me? I didn't want to go back to the cave. Every part of my mind screamed at me to stay away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The journal had stirred something deep inside me, something I hadn't thought about in years. My dad. He died in a mine collapse when I was just a kid. They said it was caused by unstable rock formations. but there were always rumors about what really happened down there. Some of the older miners used to talk about strange things they'd seen in the tunnels, shadows that moved on their own, whispers that seemed to come from the walls. My dad never mentioned any of it to me, but after he died, I found a notebook tucked away in his toolbox. It was filled with strange drawings, figures like the ones I'd seen in the cave, pulling people into solid rock. I hadn't thought about that notebook in years. After my dad's death, I'd shoved it into a box and buried it in the attic, too scared to look at it again. But now I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I climbed up into the attic and searched through old boxes until I found it. The cover was worn and dusty, but when I opened it, the drawings inside were as vivid as ever. My dad had drawn them in pencil, his lines shaky but detailed. There were figures with long arms and hollow faces, just like the ones on the cave walls, and beneath one of the drawings, he'd written a single word. Them. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. The drawings grew darker and more frantic as they went on, figures surrounding miners, pulling them into shadows, dragging them into walls. On the last page, my dad had scrawled a warning. Don't let them take you. I sat there for hours, staring at that notebook and trying to make sense of it all. Could my dad have known about the cave? Had he seen those things himself? And if he had, why hadn't he warned anyone? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this wasn't just a coincidence. My dad's death, Samuel Grayson's journal, and what I'd seen in the cave, they were all connected somehow. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I packed up my gear, flashlights, rope, extra batteries, and headed back to the park office. Mark wasn't there yet, which was probably for the best. He would have tried to stop me if he'd known what I was planning. The forest felt different this time as I made my way back to the cave entrance. The air was colder, heavier somehow, and every sound seemed sharper. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant calls of birds in the trees. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the entrance to the cave, I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The metallic smell hit me immediately, stronger than before, and my flashlight flickered slightly. As I turned it on, I took a deep breath and started down the tunnel. The carvings on the walls seemed darker now, almost like they'd been burned into the stone instead of etched. The whispers started again, after just a few minutes, soft at first, but growing louder with every step I took. This time, though, they sounded different. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were calling my name. Joseph. My blood ran cold as I froze in place. The voices were coming from all around me now, soft and eerie but unmistakable. Joseph. I clenched my fists and forced myself to keep moving. Whatever was down here wanted me to be afraid, wanted me to turn back, but I wasn't going to let it win. Not this time. As I rounded a bend in the tunnel, my flashlight beam caught something on the ground, a piece of fabric caught on a jagged rock. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, and it was covered in blood. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what this meant. Someone else had been down here recently, and they hadn't made it out. I stared at the bloody sleeve for what felt like forever. My flashlight beam hovered over it, shaking slightly in my hand. The blood had dried, but it hadn't been there long. It was still dark red, not the rusty brown of something old. Whoever had left it behind couldn't have been here more than a few days. I crouched down to get a better look. The fabric was torn, like it had been snagged on the rock while someone was struggling. My mind raced with questions. Was this from one of the missing surveyors? Had they seen what I'd seen? Had they been taken? The whispers started again, louder this time and more insistent. They weren't calling my name anymore. They were just there, surrounding me, filling the air with their eerie, overlapping voices. I stood up quickly and shone my flashlight around the tunnel. The carvings on the wall seemed to shift in the light, almost like they were moving. I blinked a few times, trying to convince myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a handprint on the wall, not carved into the stone like the others, but smeared in blood. It was small, like it belonged to a child, and it looked fresh. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. Every step felt heavier now, like the air was pressing down on me harder. With every inch I went deeper into the cave. The ground beneath me grew softer and wetter, squishing under my boots as I walked. My flashlight flickered again and I tapped it nervously. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, and I froze as my flashlight beam swept across it. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them, stretching from floor to ceiling. They depicted scenes of people being pulled into darkness by those same long-armed figures I'd seen before. In the center of the chamber was something even worse, a pile of bones. They weren't ancient or fossilized, they were fresh. Some of them still had scraps of flesh clinging to them, and the metallic smell in the air was so strong now that I had to cover my nose with my sleeve. I wanted to turn back. I needed to turn back. But something inside me wouldn't let me. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something primal. I had to know what had happened here. I had to know what had taken those people and what connection it had to my dad. As I stepped closer to the pile of bones, the whispers grew louder again. They weren't coming from all around me anymore. They were coming from behind me. I spun around quickly, shining my flashlight down the tunnel I'd just come through. At first, there was nothing, just empty darkness stretching back toward the entrance. But then I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of my flashlight beam. It wasn't like a normal shadow. It didn't follow the shape of anything nearby. It was tall and thin, with long arms that stretched out unnaturally far. It moved slowly toward me, gliding across the ground just like before. My heart pounded as I backed away instinctively, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't risk taking my eyes off it. The whispers grew louder still, almost deafening now, and as they did, more shadows began to appear, dozens of them, emerging from the walls themselves like they were stepping out of water. I stumbled backward until I hit something solid, a rock wall at the edge of the chamber, and realized too late that I'd trapped myself. There was nowhere left to run. The shadows closed in around me slowly, their hollow faces staring at me without eyes or mouths. The air grew colder with every step they took, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. And then they stopped. The whispers fell silent all at once, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. The shadows stood there motionless for what felt like hours, just staring at me without eyes, before one of them raised its arm and pointed toward something behind me. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. At first, there was nothing, just more carvings on the walls. But then I noticed something strange. One of the carvings looked different from the others. It wasn't depicting people being pulled into darkness. It showed a man standing alone in a cave surrounded by shadows, holding a notebook, my dad's notebook. I stared at the carving of the man holding the notebook, my dad's notebook. My breath caught in my throat. How could this be here? How could something carved into solid stone show something so specific, something so personal? My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. The shadows were still there, standing motionless. Around me, I could feel their presence like a weight pressing against my chest. They didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. It was like they were waiting for something. I didn't know what else to do, so I reached into my pack and pulled out my dad's notebook. The second I held it up, the shadows reacted. They shifted slightly, almost like they were leaning forward to get a better look. The air grew colder, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadows didn't answer, not with words at least, but one of them raised its arm again and pointed toward another tunnel leading out of the chamber. The message was clear. They wanted me to go deeper, Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, but I couldn't, not now. Not after everything I'd seen. If this had something to do with my dad, if he'd known about these things, I had to find out the truth. I took a shaky breath and stepped toward the tunnel they were pointing to. As I moved, the shadows parted slightly, creating a narrow path for me to walk through. It felt like walking through a crowd of people who were all staring at me without saying a word. The whispers started again as soon as I entered the new tunnel. They were softer this time, almost like they were trying to guide me instead of scare me. The carvings on the walls grew more detailed as I went deeper, scenes of people being taken by the shadows, dragged into darkness, but also scenes of people fighting back. One carving showed a man holding up a light, a lantern or a torch, and driving the shadows away. Another showed someone using what looked like symbols carved into stone to trap them. I stopped in front of one particular carving that caught my attention. It showed a group of people standing together in a circle, holding hands, while the shadows surrounded them. In the center of the circle was a single figure holding what looked like my dad's notebook. My heart pounded as I stared at it. Could this mean there was a way to stop them? A way to fight back? Or was it just another warning? Before I could think too much about it, I heard something behind me, a faint sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the whispers this time. It was footsteps. I spun around quickly, shining my flashlight down the tunnel behind me. At first, there was nothing, just empty darkness stretching back toward the chamber. But then I saw movement. It wasn't one of the shadows this time. It was a person. Joe! A familiar voice called out, echoing through the tunnel. It was Mark. He was running toward me with a flashlight in one hand and a radio in the other. His face was pale, and he looked more scared than I'd ever seen him before. "What are you doing here?" I asked as he reached me, my voice shaking with relief and confusion. "I could ask you the same thing," he said breathlessly. "When you didn't come back last night, I got worried. Then I found your truck parked near the cave entrance and figured you'd gone back in." "You shouldn't have come," I said quickly. "It's not safe down here." "No kidding," he muttered, glancing nervously at the carvings on the walls. "What is all this? It's hard to explain," I said, running a hand through my hair. "But there's something down here. Something dangerous." Mark frowned, but didn't argue. He must have seen how serious I was, because he just nodded and said, "Well, whatever it is, we need to get out of here before—" He stopped mid-sentence as his flashlight beam swept across something further down the tunnel. Another figure standing perfectly still in the darkness. At first, we thought it was another person, maybe one of the missing surveyors, but then it started moving toward us in that same unnatural way I'd seen before, gliding across the ground without making a sound. "Oh, God," Mark whispered, taking a step back. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him with me as we turned and bolted back toward the chamber. The whispers grew louder again as we ran, echoing off the walls like a chorus of voices screaming all at once. The ground beneath us felt slick and uneven, but we didn't dare slow down. When we reached the chamber again, we stopped dead in our tracks. The shadows were gone, but so were all the exits. The chamber was silent now, eerily so. The whispers had stopped, and the oppressive cold that had clung to the air moments ago seemed to vanish. But that didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm. Mark and I stood there, breathing hard, our flashlights darting across the walls of the chamber. The carvings were still there, but the shadows, the ones that had been surrounding me just minutes ago, were gone. And so were all the tunnels leading out of the chamber. This can't be happening," Mark stammered, his voice trembling. "Where did they go? Where's the way out?" I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't even know how to begin explaining what was happening. All I knew was that we were trapped. I stepped forward cautiously, shining my flashlight across the walls, hoping to find some sign of an exit. But no matter where I looked, all I saw were carvings, hundreds of them, staring back at me like silent witnesses to whatever was about to happen. Then, without warning, my flashlight flickered and went out. "Mark," I said quickly, my voice tight with panic. "Turn your light this way." He didn't respond. "Mark?" I turned around, but he wasn't there anymore. My heart dropped into my stomach as I frantically scanned the chamber with my now useless flashlight. The darkness was so thick it felt like it was pressing against my skin. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hands in front of me. "Mark!" I shouted again, my voice echoing off the walls. This time, I heard something in response, not Mark's voice, but a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere at once. The sound grew louder, deeper, until it felt like it was vibrating through the ground beneath me. And then I saw it. At first it was just a shape in the darkness, a massive shadow that seemed to rise up from the floor itself. But as it moved closer, its form became clearer. It wasn't like the other shadows I'd seen before. This one was different, bigger, more solid somehow. Its arms were impossibly long, stretching out toward me like they could wrap around the entire chamber. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void of nothingness, an empty black hole that seemed to suck in all the light around it. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone as the thing loomed closer and closer. The air grew colder with every step it took until I could see my breath misting in front of me again. And then it spoke. Not with words exactly, it didn't have a mouth, but with a voice that seemed to echo inside my head. It wasn't one voice, but many, dozens of them, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. But somehow I knew what it meant. It wanted me to stay. It wanted me to join them, the shadows on the walls, the ones who had been taken before me. It wanted me to become part of this place forever. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as tears streamed down my face. "No, you can't have me." The thing paused for a moment as if considering my defiance. Then its arms stretched out further toward me, and I felt something cold wrap around my chest, like invisible hands pulling me forward. I screamed and fought against it with everything I had, but it was no use. The thing was too strong, too powerful, and I could feel myself being dragged closer and closer to its gaping void of a face. Just when I thought all hope was lost, something changed. A light appeared in the darkness, a faint glow coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't much at first, just a tiny flicker, but as it grew brighter, the thing recoiled slightly as if it were afraid of it. I turned toward the light and saw Mark standing there at the edge of the chamber, holding up a flare he must have grabbed from his pack. His face was pale with fear, but his hands were steady as he held the bright red flame high above his head. "Get away from him," he shouted at the thing. The light from the flare seemed to burn through the darkness like fire through paper. The thing let out a horrible screeching sound and started to retreat back into the shadows where it had come from. Mark ran over to me and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him as we both backed away from the retreating entity. "Come on," he shouted over the sound of its screeching. "We have to get out of here." "But how?" I yelled back. "There's no way out." He pointed toward one of the walls where an opening had suddenly appeared, a narrow tunnel leading upward, toward what looked like daylight in the distance. We didn't waste any time questioning it. We just ran for our lives. Mark and I sprinted through the narrow tunnel, the flare in his hand, casting flickering shadows on the walls as we ran. The screeching sound from the entity behind us grew fainter with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and my lungs burned with every breath. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing so much that we had to squeeze through sideways. The metallic smell lingered in the air, but now it was mixed with something else, something earthy and damp. It felt like we were climbing higher, moving closer to the surface. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled into another chamber. This one was smaller than the last, but brighter, thanks to a faint beam of sunlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air as Mark dropped the flare beside me. We made it," he said between breaths, his voice shaky but relieved. I wanted to believe him, but something about this chamber felt different, like it wasn't just another random part of the cave. The walls were smoother here, almost polished, and there were carvings again, but these weren't like the ones I'd seen before. They weren't warnings or depictions of people being taken. They looked more like instructions. Mark noticed them, too, and walked over to examine them while I tried to catch my breath. "What do you think these mean?" he asked, shining his flashlight over the carvings. I got up slowly and joined him. The carvings showed symbols arranged in a circle, similar to the ones I'd seen in my dad's notebook. In the center of the circle was a figure holding up a light while shadows surrounded them. "It's a ritual," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Or some kind of protection." Mark frowned. "Protection from what?" I hesitated before answering. "From them." He didn't argue or ask questions this time. He just nodded grimly and kept studying the carvings. "Do you think this is how we stop them?" he asked after a moment. I wasn't sure how to answer. The carvings seemed to suggest that light could drive them away, but was it enough? Could it really keep us safe? As I stared at the symbols on the wall, something clicked in my mind. The notebook. My dad's notebook had similar symbols drawn inside it, along with notes about how they worked. I pulled it out of my pack and flipped through the pages frantically until I found what I was looking for. A diagram of a circle with symbols arranged around it. "This is it," I said, holding up the notebook for Mark to see. "This is how we stop them." He looked at me skeptically. "You're sure?" "No," I admitted honestly, "but it's all we've got." We worked quickly, using rocks and pieces of chalk from our packs to recreate the circle on the floor of the chamber. Mark held up his flashlight while I copied the symbols from my dad's notebook as carefully as I could. The whispers started again as we worked, soft at first, but growing louder with every symbol we added to the circle. It felt like they were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "Hurry!" Mark said nervously, glancing over his shoulder toward the tunnel we'd come through. "I'm trying," I muttered, my hands shaking as I drew the final symbol. As soon as we finished the circle, something changed. The air grew colder again, so cold that I could see frost forming on the ground around us, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of calm in the chamber. Mark stepped into the center of the circle and held up his flashlight again. "Now, what?" he asked. Before I could answer, a shadow appeared at the edge of the chamber, then another and another. They weren't gliding toward us this time. They were standing still just outside the circle, as if they couldn't cross it. "It's working," I said breathlessly. Mark nodded, but didn't relax. "Let's hope it keeps working." The shadows didn't move closer. They just stood there, silently watching us with their hollow faces. The whispers grew louder again, filling the chamber with their eerie voices until it felt like they might drown out our thoughts. But no matter how loud they got or how many shadows appeared, they couldn't cross into the circle. For once in this nightmare, we were safe. The circle held. The shadows stayed just outside its edge, shifting and swaying like they were testing its strength. Their hollow faces stared at us, and the whispers grew louder, more desperate. It was like they knew we had found a way to fight back, and they didn't like it. Mark and I stood in the center of the circle, clutching our flashlights like lifelines. The beam from his flare had burned out, leaving us with only the weak glow of our lights to push back the darkness. "What now?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible over the whispers. I didn't have an answer. The notebook didn't say what to do next. It only showed how to create the circle. But I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't stay here forever. The shadows weren't going to give up, and eventually we'd run out of light. I flipped through my dad's notebook again, searching for anything that might help us. My hands were shaking so badly that it was hard to focus on the words. Then I saw it, a note scribbled in the margin of one of the pages. Light is their weakness, but they fear fire most of all. Fire. My heart raced as I remembered the small emergency kit in my pack. It wasn't much, just a few matches and a tiny canister of fuel for my camping stove, but it might be enough. I have an idea, I said, pulling the kit out of my bag. Mark looked at me like I was crazy. You want to light a fire in a cave? It's our only chance, I said firmly. If we can drive them back far enough, maybe we can find a way out. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right, let's do it. I crouched down in the center of the circle and started working as quickly as I could. My fingers fumbled with the matches as I struck one against the box, but on the third try, it sparked to life. The tiny flame flickered in the cold air, casting long shadows across the walls of the chamber. The reaction from the shadows was immediate. They recoiled violently from the light, letting out a collective screech that made my ears ring. The whispers turned into screams, horrible, guttural sounds that echoed off the walls like a storm. "Keep going!" Mark shouted over the noise. I grabbed a piece of cloth from my pack and wrapped it around a stick to make a makeshift torch. Then I poured some of the fuel onto it and held it up to the flame. The fire roared to life, brighter and hotter than I expected. The shadows shrank back even further, retreating toward the edges of the chamber. Some of them disappeared entirely into cracks in the walls, while others hovered just out of reach, like they were waiting for their chance to strike. I handed Mark another stick and helped him light it. Together, we held our torches high and stepped out of the circle. The shadows didn't follow us this time. They couldn't get close enough without being burned by the flames, but they didn't leave either. They stayed just beyond the reach of our light, watching us with those empty faces. We moved cautiously through the chamber, keeping our torches between us and them at all times. The tunnel we'd come through earlier was gone now, sealed off somehow. But there was another opening on the far side of the room that hadn't been there before. "That's our way out," Mark said, nodding toward it. I wasn't so sure. Something about it felt wrong. But we didn't have any other options. As we approached the opening, one of the shadows darted forward suddenly, faster than anything I'd seen before, and reached for Mark's torch. He swung it wildly in response, sending sparks flying into the air. The shadow let out a horrible screech and disappeared into thin air like smoke blown away by wind. "They're getting bolder," Mark muttered under his breath. "Then we need to move," I said urgently. We stepped into the tunnel together, holding our torches high as we made our way deeper into the darkness. The walls seemed to close in around us as we walked, narrowing until we could barely fit through side by side. The whispers followed us every step of the way, soft at first, but growing louder again with every turn we took. It felt like they were trying to surround us, to trap us in this place forever. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we saw something ahead. Another chamber bathed in faint blue light coming from an underground pool at its center. The water shimmered strangely, almost like it wasn't really water at all, but something alive. And standing on its surface was it. The entity from before, the one with long arms and a hollow face, was waiting for us. The entity stood on the surface of the shimmering pool, its long arms hanging at its sides. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight. The hollow void where its face should have been seemed to pull at the light from our torches, making the chamber feel darker despite the flames. Mark and I stopped in our tracks, frozen by the sight of it. The whispers were deafening now, echoing off the walls, like 1,000 voices screaming all at once. My hands tightened around the torch, and I could feel sweat dripping down my face despite the cold air. "What do we do?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The entity wasn't attacking us, not yet, but it wasn't retreating either. It was just waiting. Then I remembered something from my dad's notebook, one of the last entries he'd written. "They feed on fear. Don't let them take your light." "They feed on fear," I said out loud, more to myself than to Mark. "What?" he asked, glancing at me nervously. "They're trying to scare us," I said, my voice growing steadier as I spoke. "That's how they get stronger. That's how they take people." Mark looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "And what are we supposed to do about that? Pretend we're not terrified?" "Not pretend," I said firmly. "We have to fight it." He didn't look convinced, but there wasn't time to argue. The entity started moving toward us slowly, gliding across the surface of the pool like it was weightless. The whispers grew louder with every step it took, and I could feel my fear rising again, despite my best efforts to stay calm. I held up my torch and stepped forward, forcing myself to meet its hollow gaze. "You're not taking us," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to echo through the chamber. The entity paused for a moment, as if it was surprised by my defiance. Then it stretched out one of its long arms toward me. The whispers turned into a deafening roar as I swung the torch in front of me, sending sparks flying into the air. The flame flared brightly for a moment, and the entity recoiled slightly, its arm retreating back toward its body. "It's working!" Mark shouted behind me. I didn't stop to think. I just kept moving forward, holding the torch high and stepping closer to the pool. The entity screeched in response, a horrible sound that made my ears ring, but it didn't attack again. Instead, it started retreating toward the center of the pool. Mark joined me, his own torch held high as we advanced together. The light from our flames seemed to push back against the darkness in the chamber, driving the shadows further away. As we reached the edge of the pool, I noticed something strange about the water, or whatever it was. It wasn't just shimmering, it was glowing faintly with that same eerie blue light I'd seen before. And beneath its surface, there were faces, dozens of them. They were human faces, men and women and even children, all staring up at us with wide, empty eyes. Their mouths were open in silent screams, and their expressions were frozen in terror. My stomach turned at the sight of them, but I forced myself to focus on the entity standing above them. It was still retreating from our torches, but I could tell it wasn't going to leave willingly. "This is where they're trapped," I said quietly, gesturing toward the faces in the water. "This is where it takes them." Mark nodded grimly. "Then we end it here." I wasn't sure how we were supposed to do that. How do you fight something that isn't even alive? But then I remembered another note from my dad's notebook. "Fire cleanses all." I looked at Mark and held up my fuel canister. "We burn it." His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't argue. He just nodded and stepped back as I unscrewed the cap and poured what little fuel was left into the pool. The blue glow flickered as the liquid spread across its surface. The faces beneath it seemed to shift slightly, like they were moving for the first time in who knows how long. The entity let out another screech and lunged toward me suddenly, but Mark swung his torch in front of it just in time. The flame caught on its arm briefly before it pulled back again with an ear-piercing, "Whale, hurry!" Mark shouted. I struck another match and dropped it into the pool without hesitating. For a moment, nothing happened, and then everything happened at once. The fuel caught fire instantly, sending bright orange flames racing across the surface of the pool. The blue glow disappeared completely as smoke filled the chamber, choking out both light and air. The entity let out one final screech, a sound so loud and piercing that it felt like my skull might split open. And then silence. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. No shadows, no faces in the water. Nothing but an empty chamber filled with ash and soot. Mark and I stood there for a long moment without speaking before he finally broke the silence. "Is it over?" I nodded slowly, though part of me wasn't entirely sure. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It's over." We found our way out of the cave shortly after that, following another tunnel that led us back to daylight. The sun was rising as we emerged into the forest, casting warm light over everything like a promise that we'd made it through alive. But even as we walked back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That some part of me had been left behind in that cave along with those shadows, and maybe some part of them had followed us out. My name is Vanessa Mitchell, and I'm a senior park ranger at Everglades National Park. It's not the kind of job most people dream about, but for me, it's perfect. The endless waterways, the thick cypress trees, and the quiet hum of nature. It's where I feel most alive. At least, that's what I used to think. It was April 2025, during one of the worst droughts we'd ever seen. The Everglades were drying up fast, exposing parts of the swamp that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. The airboats barely skimmed over what was left of the water, and the wildlife was behaving strangely. Birds that should have been nesting were flying in circles for hours. Alligators were gathering in tight groups, forming shapes that looked almost deliberate, like triangles or spirals. It was weird, but I'd seen weird before, or so I thought. That morning started like any other. I was out on patrol with my assistant, Jake. He was young, eager, and always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. We were checking on reports of missing hikers, 3 in just 2 weeks. People vanish out here sometimes. It's easy to get lost in the maze of waterways. But this felt different. The family said their loved ones were experienced outdoorsmen who wouldn't just wander off. We found their airboat near a mangrove thicket about an hour into our patrol. At first glance, it didn't look damaged, no claw marks or signs of an alligator attack, but when I got closer, my stomach twisted. The boat was covered in this slimy green algae that shimmered like oil under the sun, and there was ice, actual frost, clinging to the edges of the seats and steering wheel. That didn't make any sense. It was over 90 degrees out. "Vanessa, you seeing this?" Jake called out from behind me. "Yeah," I said, running my fingers over the frost. It melted instantly, leaving my hand wet and cold. "Take some pictures and bag a sample of that algae." Jake nodded and got to work, while I scanned the area for more clues. That's when I noticed something else. A faint trail leading into the water. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy through the mud. "Jake," I called out again, my voice tight. "Do you see this?" He walked over and squinted at the trail. "What do you think it is?" "A gator." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. We followed the trail to where it disappeared into a shallow pool of water. The surface was perfectly still, like glass, even though there was a breeze blowing through the trees. "Creepy," Jake muttered. I didn't respond because something about that pool made my skin crawl. It wasn't just still. It felt wrong, like it was watching us somehow. "We should head back," I said finally. "Let's get this algae tested." Jake didn't argue, which wasn't like him at all. He must have felt it too, that heavy, uneasy feeling hanging in the air. As we turned to leave, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper coming from the direction of the water. It sounded almost like my name. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked. I shook my head quickly, even though I had heard it too. "Let's go." We climbed back into our airboat and sped away from that eerie little pool as fast as we could. But even as we left it behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. The next few days were strange. I couldn't stop thinking about that abandoned airboat or the whisper I thought I heard. Jake said it was probably just the wind, but I wasn't so sure. Something about that pool of water didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just me either. The other, Rangers started reporting odd things happening around the park. One of them, Sarah, swore she saw glowing lights moving underwater near the southern marshes late at night. She called them ghost lights, but no one took her seriously. Another ranger said the deer were acting weird, standing perfectly, still for hours at a time, staring into the distance like they were hypnotized. And then there was the wildlife. The alligators were still gathering in those strange shapes, forming spirals and triangles in the mud. I'd never seen anything like it before, and neither had anyone else. It felt like nature was trying to tell us something, or warn us. One night I decided to check out the southern marshes myself. Jake offered to come with me, but I told him to stay behind and keep an eye on the station. Something about this felt personal, like I needed to face it alone. I took the airboat out around midnight when the park was quiet and still. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the water. As I navigated through the narrow channels, I kept my eyes peeled for anything unusual. About half an hour in, I saw them, the ghost lights Sarah had talked about. At first, I thought they were reflections from the moon, or maybe bioluminescent algae. But as I got closer, I realized they were moving, darting back and forth under the surface like they had a mind of their own. I killed the engine and let the boat drift closer to the lights. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't look away. They were beautiful in a strange way, soft blue and green glows that danced like fireflies underwater. Then I heard it again, a whisper. It wasn't loud or clear enough to make out words, but it was definitely there. This time, it didn't just sound like my name, it sounded like someone calling for help. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. The light stopped moving and hovered in place for a moment before disappearing completely. The water went dark again, and everything was silent except for the sound of my breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the lights had been. Finally, I started up the engine and headed back to the station. As much as I wanted answers, I knew better than to push my luck. The next morning, Jake burst into my office looking pale and shaken. "Vanessa," he said breathlessly, "you need to see this." He handed me his phone and played a video he'd taken during his patrol earlier that morning. It showed a group of alligators lying in a shallow pool of water, but they weren't just lying there randomly. They were arranged in a perfect circle with their heads pointing inward. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jake said, "but there's more." He swiped to another video showing what looked like ancient carvings on a submerged rock formation near one of the dried-up areas of the swamp. The carvings were faded but still visible, symbols that looked like warnings or maybe instructions. "I think we need to call someone," Jake said nervously. I nodded slowly but didn't say anything. Deep down, I knew no one would believe us. Not without proof that something unnatural was happening here. The carvings Jake found stayed on my mind all day. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were important, like they were trying to tell us something. But what? Warnings? Directions? I didn't know. All I knew was that things were getting worse. That afternoon, Jake and I decided to check out the area where he'd found the carvings. We packed up some gear, flashlights, cameras, and a waterproof notebook, and headed out in the airboat. The sun was blazing overhead, but the air felt heavy and thick, like a storm was coming even though the sky was clear. We reached the spot after about an hour. The water level was so low that parts of the swamp floor were completely exposed. That's when we saw it. A large rock formation sticking out of the mud. It looked ancient, weathered by time and water. The carvings were more visible now, and as I got closer, I realized they weren't random symbols. They were patterns, spirals, triangles and circles, just like the shapes the alligators had been forming. Jake leaned in for a closer look. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it feels deliberate." As we studied the carvings, a strange sound broke through the silence, a low hum that seemed to come from deep below us. It wasn't loud, but it made my chest vibrate like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. Yeah. The hum grew louder, and then we saw it, bubbles rising, to the surface of the water nearby. At first, I thought it might be a gator or some kind of gas escaping from the mud. But then something moved under the water. Something big. "Jake," I said quietly, backing away from the edge of the boat. "We need to go." He didn't argue. We climbed back into the airboat and started heading back to the station. But as we sped through the narrow channels, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. That night, everything changed. I was in my office going over maps of the park when Jake burst in again. This time, he looked terrified. "Vanessa," he said, his voice shaking. "It's Sarah." "What about Sarah?" I asked, standing up quickly. "She's gone," he said. "She went out on patrol an hour ago and never came back." My heart sank. Sarah was one of our best rangers, experienced and careful. If she was missing, something had gone very wrong. "We need to find her," I said firmly. Jake nodded, and we grabbed our gear before heading out into the night. The park was eerily quiet as we searched for any sign of Sarah or her airboat. After about an hour, we found her boat drifting near a mangrove thicket, the same area where we'd found that first abandoned airboat days ago. The boat was empty. "Sarah," I called out into the darkness. There was no answer, just the sound of water lapping against the side of her boat. Jake shone his flashlight into the water, and that's when we saw it. A shape moving just below the surface. It wasn't an alligator or a fish. It was something else entirely. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its body was translucent like jellyfish skin, and its movements were slow and deliberate. "What is that?" Jake whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. The thing stopped moving and seemed to turn toward us as if it could see us, even though it didn't have eyes. For a moment, none of us moved or breathed. Then it disappeared into the murky depths without a sound. We didn't wait around to see if it would come back. We sped back to the station as fast as we could, our hearts pounding in our chests. When we got back, I called every ranger on duty and told them to stay inside until further notice. Whatever was happening out there wasn't natural, and it wasn't safe. But deep down I knew this wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that translucent figure moving under the water. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the way it felt. Like it was watching us even though it didn't have eyes. Whatever it was, I knew it wasn't just some strange animal. It was something more. The next morning, I decided to reach out to someone who might know more about what we were dealing with. Ray Osceola was a local guide and a member of the Miccosukee tribe. He'd lived in the Everglades his whole life and knew the land better than anyone. If anyone could help us make sense of this, it was him. Ray met me at the station later that afternoon. He was a quiet man, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that told me he understood the gravity of the situation. "You said you found carvings?" he asked as we sat down in my office. I nodded and showed him the pictures Jake had taken. Ray studied them for a long time without saying anything. Finally he spoke. "These are warnings." "Warnings?" I repeated, leaning forward. Ray nodded slowly. "My people have stories about this place, about something that lives in the water. We call it Hachiona, which means the water skinwalker. It's not an animal or a spirit, it's something else entirely." "What does it do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It lures people," Ray said simply. "It calls to them, makes them see things or hear things that aren't there, and once they go into the water, they don't come back." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Have you ever seen it?" Ray shook his head. "No, but my grandfather did when he was young. He said it looked human but wasn't. He said it could change its shape, blend into the water so you couldn't tell where it ended and the swamp began." I thought about Sarah and the hikers who had gone missing. Had they heard the whispers too? Had they seen those ghost lights? And if they had, were they still alive? Ray must have seen the fear in my eyes because he leaned forward and placed a hand on my desk. "You need to stay out of the water," he said firmly. "Whatever's happening here, it's dangerous." I nodded, but deep down, I knew staying out of the water wasn't an option anymore. If we wanted answers, and if we wanted to stop this thing, we had to face it head on. Later that evening, I got another call, this time from Dr. Leila Patel, an EPA scientist who had been studying the effects of the drought on the park's ecosystem. She sounded nervous, almost frantic. "Vanessa," she said as soon as I picked up, "we need to talk." "What's going on?" I asked. "I've been analyzing water samples from the areas where you reported strange activity," she said quickly, "and there's something in them." "What do you mean, something?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "It's biological," she said. "Human biological material." I froze. "Human? Are you saying—" "I don't know what I'm saying," Dr. Patel interrupted, her voice trembling. "But whatever's in that water, it's alive." I hung up and stared at my desk for a long time after that call. Between Ray's warnings and Dr. Patel's findings, one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random phenomenon or freak accident of nature. There was something living in these waters, something dangerous, and it wasn't going away on its own. That night, as I sat alone in my office trying to piece everything together, I decided to dig deeper into park records to see if anything like this had happened before. What I found made my blood run cold. There were old ranger logs from decades ago, 1957 to be exact, that described similar events: disappearances, strange lights in the water, and wildlife behaving unnaturally. The logs mentioned attempts to contain whatever was causing these incidents, but didn't go into detail about how or why those attempts failed. One entry stood out more than any other. "The entity cannot be killed or captured. It can only be contained." I couldn't stop thinking about that log entry. The entity cannot be killed or captured. It can only be contained. What did they mean by contained? And why wasn't there any record of what happened after that? It felt like someone had deliberately erased parts of the story, leaving behind only enough to scare anyone who stumbled across it. I sat back in my chair, staring at the logs spread out on my desk. My mind was racing, but one thought kept pushing its way to the front. Why does this feel familiar? I didn't want to admit it, but deep down, I already knew the answer. This wasn't the first time I'd felt that eerie pull from the water. It had happened years ago, long before I became a ranger. When I was 19, I was part of a Navy diving team. We were training off the coast of Florida when something went wrong. I'd been underwater for about 20 minutes when I felt something. It wasn't a current or a fish brushing past me. It was more like a presence. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it. A faint whisper. It sounded like my name. I panicked and tried to surface too quickly. That's when it happened. A sharp pain in my throat, like something had grabbed me from the inside. By the time my team pulled me out of the water, I was barely conscious. The doctors said it was a diving accident, and that the pain in my throat was from an air embolism caused by ascending too fast. But I never believed them, not entirely. After that, my voice changed. It became raspy, almost like a permanent whisper. The doctors said it was nerve damage, but now I wasn't so sure. Sitting there in my office, staring at those old logs, it hit me. Whatever's in these waters, it's the same thing that almost killed me all those years ago. I didn't have much time to dwell on it because Jake came rushing into my office again. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "Vanessa," he said breathlessly. "Dr. Patel, she's gone." "What do you mean she's gone?" I asked, standing up so fast my chair tipped over. "She went out to collect more water samples this morning," Jake said. "She told me she'd be back by noon, but she never showed up." My stomach dropped. Dr. Patel knew better than anyone how dangerous this situation was. Why would she go out alone? "We have to find her," I said firmly. Jake nodded, and we grabbed our gear before heading out into the swamp again. The sun was starting to set as we navigated through the narrow channels, casting long shadows over the water. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the splash of a fish, made my heart race. After about an hour of searching, we found her boat drifting near one of the deeper pools in the park. Just like Sarah's boat, it was empty. "Dr. Patel," I called. Out into the growing darkness, no answer. Jake shone his flashlight into the water while I scanned the area for any signs of her. That's when we saw it, a faint glow coming from beneath the surface. "Vanessa," Jake whispered nervously. "Do you see that?" "I see it," I said quietly. The glow grew brighter as we watched, and then something broke through the surface. A hand. For a split second, I thought it was Dr. Patel reaching for help, but then I saw it wasn't her hand at all. It was translucent and webbed, with long fingers that ended in sharp claws. "Go!" I shouted to Jake as I started up the airboat engine. We sped away as fast as we could, but even as we put distance between ourselves and that pool of water, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever was down there wasn't done with us yet. After what we saw in the water, Jake and I didn't speak much on the ride back to the station. I could tell he was shaken. I was too, but we both knew we couldn't stop now. Dr. Patel was still missing, and every second we wasted felt like it was pulling her further out of reach. When we got back to the station, I went straight to my office and started digging through every file I could find about the park's history. There had to be something, anything, that could explain what was happening here. Jake sat across from me, flipping through maps and old ranger logs, his face pale and tense. "Vanessa," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "What if this thing, whatever it is, has been here all along? What if it's been hiding in plain sight?" I looked up at him, my mind racing. "You mean like it's part of the swamp?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, think about it. This place is huge. There are parts of the Everglades no one's even explored yet. If something wanted to stay hidden, this would be the perfect place." He wasn't wrong. The Everglades were massive, a maze of waterways and dense vegetation that stretched for miles. If something was out there, it could easily stay hidden for centuries. As we talked, I remembered something Ray had said about his grandfather seeing the water skinwalker when he was young. That would have been decades ago, around the same time as those old ranger logs from 1957. I pulled out the logs again and started reading through them more carefully. Most of them were vague, mentions of strange lights, missing hikers, and unusual wildlife behavior. But one entry stood. "Oh, the containment efforts failed. Higher authorities have taken over." "What does that mean?" Jake asked, leaning over my shoulder. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it sounds like someone else got involved. Someone higher up." Jake frowned. "Like who before?" I could answer. There was a knock at my office door. It was Director Walsh, the head of our ranger division. He rarely came down to our station unless something big was going on. "Vanessa," he said as he stepped into the room, "we need to talk." I exchanged a quick glance with Jake before following Walsh into the hallway. He led me to a small conference room and closed the door behind us. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Walsh hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's something you need to know about this park, something that isn't in any of the public records." My heart started pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" Walsh sighed and sat down at the table, motioning for me to do the same. "Back in the 1950s, he began, there was a government project conducted here in the Everglades, a classified operation called Project Deep Current." I frowned. "What kind of project?" "They were studying an anomaly in the water," Walsh explained, "something they believed could be used for military purposes." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You mean they were studying this thing? The entity?" Walsh nodded grimly. "They thought they could control it. use it as a weapon against our enemies, but they underestimated how powerful it was. What happened? I asked quietly. The SOAR project ended in disaster, Walsh said. Several scientists went missing, and those who survived refused to talk about what they saw. Eventually, they abandoned the project and sealed off the area where most of the activity occurred. Sealed off? I repeated, my mind racing. There's a sinkhole deep in the swamp, Walsh said. It's where they believe the entity originated from, or at least where it's strongest. They tried to contain it there using sound waves and other experimental methods, but, well, you've seen how effective that was. I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything he'd just told me. Why are you telling me this now? I asked finally. Walsh hesitated again before answering. Because whatever's happening out there, it's getting worse. And if we don't act fast, more people are going to die. Walsh's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, a sinkhole, the origin of the entity. It all made sense now. The strange lights, the whispers, the disappearances. Everything pointed back to that one place. And if we wanted to stop this thing, that's where we had to go. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I prepared. Jake and I gathered everything we could think of. Flashlights, sound equipment, underwater cameras, and even a few old sonar buoys we found in storage. Walsh said the government had used sound waves to try to contain the entity before, so maybe it could work again. By dawn, we were ready. Ray Osceola agreed to guide us to the sinkhole, though I could tell he wasn't happy about it. This place is cursed, he said quietly as we loaded the airboat. You're playing with something you don't understand. I know, I said, meeting his gaze, but we don't have a choice. The ride to the sinkhole was tense and silent. The swamp seemed different that morning, quieter than usual. Even the birds weren't making their usual calls. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath. When we reached the sinkhole, my stomach turned. The water here was darker than anywhere else in the park, almost black and perfectly still. The edges of the sinkhole were lined with twisted roots and jagged rocks, giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. This is it, Ray said grimly. Jake and I exchanged a nervous glance before unloading our gear. We set up the sonar buoys around the perimeter of the sinkhole and activated them one by one. They emitted a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the air and water. Let's hope this works, Jake muttered as he adjusted one of the buoys. I nodded but didn't say anything. Deep down, I wasn't sure anything could stop this thing, not permanently. As we worked, I felt it again, that heavy presence in the air. It was like being watched by something you couldn't see, but knew was there. My heart raced as I scanned the water for any signs of movement. Then it happened. The water in the center of the sinkhole began to ripple, slowly at first, but then more violently. Bubbles rose to the surface, followed by that same faint glow we'd seen before. It's here, Ray whispered, his voice trembling. The glow grew brighter until it illuminated the entire sinkhole. And then it appeared. A figure rising from the depths, like a ghost emerging from a grave. It looked almost human, but not quite. Its body was translucent and shimmering, like water given form. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless except for two dark voids where eyes might have been. I froze as it turned toward us, its empty gaze locking onto me. For a moment, everything went silent. The buoys stopped humming, and even my own breathing seemed to fade away. Then I heard it, a voice inside my head. Vanessa. It wasn't just whispering anymore. It was speaking directly to me, and somehow it knew my name. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, snapping me out of my trance. He grabbed one of our underwater cameras and tossed it into the sinkhole. The entity flinched as if in pain before retreating slightly into the water. It doesn't like sound, I realized aloud. Without hesitation, I grabbed one of the sonar buoys and threw it into the center of the sinkhole. The low-frequency hum grew louder as it sank beneath the surface, sending ripples through the water. The entity let out a piercing screech, a sound that wasn't just loud, but felt like it was tearing through my mind. I dropped to my knees, clutching, my head as tears streamed down my face. "Vanessa!" Jake shouted, pulling me back toward the boat. Ray activated another buoy just as the entity lunged toward us with impossible speed. The second buoy emitted an even louder hum that seemed to freeze it in place mid-air or mid-water. It was hard to tell where its body ended and began. "Now!" Ray yelled. Jake hit a switch on our control panel, activating all 4 buoys at once. The combined sound waves created a barrier around the sinkhole, a shimmering wall of energy that pulsed with light and sound. The entity thrashed against the barrier, its form flickering like static on a broken TV screen. For a moment I thought it might break through, but then it let out one final screech before sinking back into the depths of the sinkhole. The water went still again. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity before Jake finally spoke. Did we do it?" he asked hesitantly. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking. "But at least for now, it's contained." The ride back to the station was quiet. None of us spoke, and the only sound was the low hum of the airboat's engine cutting. Through the water, my hands were still shaking, and my ears were ringing from the screech the entity had let out before it disappeared. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the dark water behind us, half expecting to see it rise again, but it didn't. When we got back to the station, Walsh was waiting for us. He looked relieved when he saw us step off the boat, but his expression quickly turned serious when he noticed how shaken we all were. "Did it work?" he asked. "For now," I said quietly. "The boys are holding it in the sinkhole." "But I don't know how long they'll last," Walsh nodded grimly. "We'll reinforce them, bring in more equipment if we have to." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew this wasn't over. The entity wasn't just some creature we could trap and forget about. It was something far older and more powerful than any of us could understand, and it wasn't going to stay contained forever. Over the next few days, life at the park slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The ghost lights stopped appearing and the wildlife started acting like itself again. But there were still reminders of what we'd been through: empty boats drifting in the water, strange patterns in the mud, and whispers that seemed to linger just out of earshot. Dr. Patel and Sarah were never found, ever. Their disappearances were officially ruled as accidents, lost to the swamp like so many others before them. But I knew better. They weren't lost. They were taken. Jake decided to transfer to another park a few weeks later. He said he needed a change of scenery, but I could tell he just wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. I didn't blame him. As for me, I stayed. I couldn't leave, not after everything I'd seen and learned. This park was my home, and I felt like it was my responsibility to protect it, even if that meant protecting people from something they couldn't see or understand. But things didn't go back to normal for me, not completely. A few weeks after we contained the entity, I started noticing small changes in myself. My throat, which had been damaged years ago during my diving accident, started feeling different, less tight, less painful. My voice became clearer, stronger, like it was healing itself. And then there were the dreams. Every night I dreamed of water, dark and endless, and a voice calling my name from somewhere deep below the surface. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was louder now, almost like an echo in my mind. Sometimes I woke up gasping for air, my skin damp with sweat, or maybe something else entirely. I haven't told anyone about this, not Ray, not Walsh, not even Jake before he left. But sometimes when I'm out on patrol and I pass by a pool of still water, I catch a glimpse of something in my reflection, something that isn't quite me, and sometimes I hear it again. Vanessa.